History is filled with monsters, but not all of them hide in the dark. Some walked the plantations by daylight, their faces calm, their secrets deadly. Tonight's story is not just about cruelty. It is about a name erased from records, a trail of vanished women, and a legend so disturbing that even whispers of it were buried. What happened in Louisiana in 1849 was never meant to be remembered, but once you hear it, you'll never forget it. She was never given a name that survived history. On paper, she existed only as a faint pencil mark, a vague reference in a ledger that listed people the way one would list cattle or tools. Yet in whispered memory, she became something else entirely. She became a shadow that moved through humid air, a presence that seemed to breathe between the cracks of time itself. Born somewhere between the rot of wooden cabins and the endless stretch of cane fields, her earliest memories were not of childhood, but of silence forced into her bones and fear folded into her spirit. No one recorded the sound of her first cry. No one wrote down the look in her eyes as she learned, far too young, that her life belonged to hands that did not care whether she lived or died. She learned to walk without being heard, to speak without sound, to exist without being seen. That was how survival worked. The quieter you were, the longer you stayed alive, and she mastered that rule better than anyone. Her real name never reached the ears of history, either because it was taken from her, beaten from her tongue, or because she buried it herself, deep inside a place no one could reach. Names had power. Names could be called, shouted, claimed. She did not want to be claimed. She did not want to be found, so she let them call her whatever they wished. Girl, child, thing, shadow, none of it mattered, because inside, she was slowly becoming something that had no need for a name. The other enslaved people noticed things about her long before the masters did. They noticed how she watched instead of spoke, how she listened instead of cried, how her eyes, dark and still, seemed to measure every movement around her. She understood patterns. She understood timing. She understood how pain moved through people and how fear changed the way bodies acted. While others broke under cruelty, she studied it. She learned its shape. She learned its smell. She learned how it spread. In the heat of Louisiana, under a sky thick with insects and unending thunderclouds, she grew into a girl who walked like she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. Her footsteps were light enough to disappear into dirt, her presence light enough to go unnoticed. That was not weakness. That was a kind of power no one taught her, a power built from being forgotten. There were rumors about where she came from. Some said she was born during a storm so violent that the trees bent like knees in prayer. Some said her mother died without a sound, biting down on cloth so the overseers wouldn't hear. Some said no one saw her born at all, that she simply appeared in the quarters one morning like mist settling after rain. And because there were no answers, the mystery around her thickened like fog around a grave. Her eyes rarely showed emotion, not joy, not sorrow, only thought, only calculation. She learned which boards creaked, which doors sang when opened, which people slept lightly and which slept like the dead. She learned where the moonlight fell at different times of night and where the shadows gathered thickest. She learned when the guards drank, when the dogs slept, when the swamp went quiet. She was a mystery even to herself, a child shaped by suffering but not broken by it. A girl who carried something ancient in her bones, something that did not feel like weakness or submission. It felt like waiting, like pressure building beneath the ground before the earth splits open. The elders kept their distance from her, not because she was loud or rebellious, but because she felt different, not evil, not dangerous, but heavier, like a storm cloud that had learned to walk. Children stopped whispering when she passed. Adults lowered their eyes. Not out of fear, but out of instinct, like animals sensing weather before it breaks. No one knew what she thought about in the quiet moments. No one knew what words circled inside her mind while she stood alone at night staring toward the tree line. But they felt it. They felt something moving behind those silent eyes, something unfinished, something patient. And in a place where people were treated as property, stripped not only of freedom but of identity, she became something far more terrifying than a prisoner. She became someone who belonged to no one. The first woman disappeared on a morning that felt no different from any other. The sky was low and grey, the air thick with the slow breath of the swamp, and the world moved forward without pause or prayer. She had risen before dawn as always, her hands already cracked and swollen from years of work, her back bent by time and expectation. Her absence was first noticed not by the masters, but by the women who worked beside her, the ones who understood that survival depended on routine, and that breaking routine was a kind of silent alarm. At first they whispered that she had run, that she had found a gap in the fences, a soft spot in the guards, a miracle in the darkness. Running was dangerous, but it was also hopeful, and hope was easier to believe than truth. Hope was easier than accepting that a familiar shape now missing from the room meant something darker was moving through their world. Then another woman vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no torn cloth, no broken skin. The beds were cold, untouched, like they had never been slept in at all. The fires went unlit where hands should have been warming cornmeal and water. The air itself seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether it was allowed to move. Whispers began to crawl through the quarters like insects. They did not travel loudly. They moved from ear to ear, carried in breath and fear. Women began counting each other in the dark, touching shoulders in the night, just to make sure they were still there. Mothers held daughters closer. Sisters slept hand to hand. The numbers grew slowly, like water rising inside a sealed room. 1, 2, 4, 7. Every disappearance smoothed away by excuses, silenced by exhaustion, buried under the idea that enslaved people were always disappearing somewhere, into rivers, into forests, into graves that were never marked. By the time the count reached double digits, fear had a shape. It sat in the corners, it breathed behind doors, it waited in the long silence between footsteps. Eyes shifted at every small noise, every unfamiliar movement. The sense of being watched settled heavy on skin like fog that never lifted. No bodies were found. That was what made it worse. Death could be understood. Death had smell, sight, finality, but absence was a wound that never closed. It stayed open, raw, and unanswered. The ground offered no comfort. The water stayed quiet. The trees stood like they had always stood. The masters called it nothing. Overseers shrugged. Guards laughed. To them, people were always losing their way, always wandering too far, always becoming nothing. The world they lived in was already built on disappearance, already shaped by loss and silence. They did not look closer because they did not need to. But the women knew. They knew because they felt it in the way the night stretched longer, in the way breathing felt heavier, in the way shadows seemed too full. Disappearance turned into a kind of living presence, a thing that walked among them without form, touching shoulders, brushing hair, passing through thin cabin walls. Some said they heard footsteps when no one was there. Soft, bare, careful. Others said they smelled strange herbs burning at night, bitter and unfamiliar, carried on slow currents of air. Some spoke of quiet humming, a sound that threaded through darkness like a thin blade of sound. The count reached 22. 22 names no longer spoken out loud. 22 places at fires left empty. 22 blankets folded in silence. The air changed after that. It felt thin, like too much had been taken and nothing given back. Even the insects grew quieter, their endless songs faltering in strange, uneasy patterns. Grief had no ceremony. Fear had no end. There were no graves to kneel beside, no stones to touch, no prayers that could find their way to something solid. There was only the shared knowledge that something moved among them unseen, and that it was patient. No one spoke of it openly. Speaking made it real. Speaking gave it a name. So they let it live in their eyes, their breaths, their hands gripping cloth at night. Every creak of wood sounded like a footstep. Every flicker of firelight looked like a figure passing a doorway. Every quiet moment felt like a test of who would still be there when the sun returned. And through it all, the world above them stayed loud and bright and careless, untouched by the slow terror growing below the floorboards. The plantation stood like a living wound carved into the earth, stretching across Louisiana soil that drank blood as easily as rain. In daylight it looked almost peaceful, rows of sugarcane swaying in obedient lines, the great house rising above them like a pale, watchful skull. But beneath that quiet surface was a silence so thick it felt unnatural, as if the land itself had learned not to speak. The enslaved quarters sat low to the ground, built from rotting wood and nailed together with rusted iron that screamed whenever the wind shifted. The air there always tasted of smoke, sweat, damp soil, and something older, something bitter that had soaked too deeply into the ground to ever be washed away. People said the land was wrong long before the plantation was built, that the soil had once belonged to forgotten rituals and older graves, though no one dared speak loudly enough for the walls to hear. The curse did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, like moisture creeping through timber. At first, it showed itself in small things. Crops spoiled too quickly. Animals fell silent at night. Dogs refused to go near certain trees, whining and pulling at their chains as if they sensed something waiting just beyond sight. The well water sometimes tasted of iron, sharp and metallic, though no one dared stop drinking it. There was a tree at the far edge of the land that the older ones avoided without explanation. Its trunk twisted unnaturally, its roots rising above the soil like fingers crawling for breath. Even the wind seemed to move differently there, slowing as if something invisible blocked its path. Birds circled it without landing. Insects gathered and then vanished, as if confused by its presence. The masters never noticed this. Or if they did, they laughed at it. To them, the land was profit and nothing more. They walked the fields, without feeling the way the ground pulled at their boots, slept in soft beds, without hearing the low, pulsing hum that sometimes seemed to rise from beneath the floor. But at night, when darkness poured over the fields like black water, the plantation felt awake. Wood expanded and cracked. Roofs shifted. Walls breathed. The spaces between buildings grew deeper, thicker, like corridors leading into something endless. Shadows moved in ways that were not caused by moon or lamp. They clung to corners. They stretched longer than they should. Some nights the air grew so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Torch flames burned shorter and dimmer, trembling as if they feared the dark. The quiet became so wide that every small sound felt like a scream. Footsteps echoed too much. Whispers traveled too far. People began to feel watched not only by eyes, but by the land itself. Like the soil was listening, like the trees were remembering, like the swamp water beyond the fields was waiting for more than insects and roots to fall into it. The swamp was its own world, thick and breathing, tangled with roots and dark water that reflected nothing clearly. It swallowed sound, it swallowed light, it swallowed things that stepped too far into it. Mist rose from its surface in slow, pale waves, curling through the fields like pale fingers. At night, small lights sometimes flickered just above the water, not lanterns, not stars, but something quieter and wrong. And then there were the sounds, low ones that didn't belong to animals or wind. A dragging sound along wood, a soft knock against walls when no one stood outside, a faint hum moving through the air like a breath that never came from human lungs. The plantation began to feel layered, as if the world people walked in was only the top, and beneath it was another version of the same place, darker, quieter, and far more patient. Dreams turned strange. People woke up tired even after sleep. Some spoke of seeing shapes where no shapes existed, tall and thin and barely visible against the night. Even the great house, with its polished floors and shining lamps, seemed uneasy. Floorboards groaned not with age but with pressure. Mirrors sometimes reflected rooms that felt slightly wrong. Doors seemed to take longer to open, longer to close, as if the building itself hesitated. The curse was never spoken of directly. It did not need words. It lived in the way breath caught in throats, in the way eyes shifted away from certain corners, in the way people unconsciously avoided certain paths after dark. It sat in the well water, in the tree roots, in the black mud that clung to bare feet. And slowly, quietly, it turned the plantation into a place where fear did not need to shout because it was already everywhere. In the deep hush of night, when the plantation surrendered to darkness and the air turned thick with breath and decay, there were rumors of strange practices moving like silent smoke through the quarters. These were not shouted stories or bold accusations, but thin whispers pressed close to trembling lips, carried only when the wind was loud enough to hide them. People spoke of bitter-smelling bundles hidden beneath loose floorboards, of ash lines drawn faintly in the dust near doorways, of small carved objects hanging from strings that rattled softly when no hands touched them. The knowledge of herbs was old, older than the chains, older than the ships that had carried them across black water. It lived in memory and muscle, in hands that crushed leaves and roots in the quiet corners of cabins. But what was once used to heal became something else in the wrong hands, twisted by desperation, sharpened by silence. Roots that eased pain could slow a heartbeat. Berries that soothed a fever could cloud a mind. Powders that helped sleep could steal breath entirely. Nothing happened loudly. No screams tore through the night, no doors were kicked open, no blood stained the dirt. That was what made it terrifying. It was soft, it was careful, it was clean. A cup set down beside a tired hand, a warm drink offered with eyes lowered in respect, a touch on the shoulder that lingered just long enough to matter. They said she learned by watching the older women, those who still remembered plants by their true names instead of the ones whispered on the plantation. She listened while grinding corn or sweeping floors, her ears always open, her face always still. She memorized the smell of crushed leaves, the taste of bitter sap, the way certain roots darkened when exposed to air. She became a quiet collector of knowledge that was never meant to be gathered by one person alone. The rituals came not from books, but from desperation. They were born in moments when suffering grew too heavy to carry awake. Some were small, a line of ash to keep bad spirits out, a whisper breathed into cupped hands before sleep, a tiny bundle of dried herbs tied with a single hair buried beneath a doorway. But some were darker, done only when no one watched, done only when the moon was gone from the sky and even the insects stopped singing. Candles burned low in hidden corners, their flames barely holding against the weight of the air. Melted wax pooled on dirt floors, shaped into forms that no one found comforting. Hushed words were spoken, not loud enough to be understood, but strong enough to feel. The sound of them pressed against walls and slipped through cracks, carrying a sense of intention that made hearts beat faster for no visible reason. Women began to feel strange sensations before they vanished. A sudden heat in the chest, a dull ache behind the eyes, a heaviness in their limbs as if the air had thickened around them. Some said they tasted metal on their tongues out of nowhere. Others remembered strange dreams, thick and slow, filled with shadows that moved without sound. There were small hidden places around the land where no one walked without reason. Beneath the leaning tree, the soil was disturbed often, softer than the rest. Near the well, faint markings appeared and disappeared like they were never meant to stay. At the edge of the swamp, tied into branches, tiny pouches could be found if someone knew where to look, each carrying a smell that made the stomach turn and the skin tighten. The fear of these practices spread without proof. No one wanted proof. Proof would make it real. Proof would force questions that might never have answers. So it lived in imagination, in sleepless nights, in hands clenching blankets until knuckles turned pale. People stopped sharing drinks without hesitation. They watched who touched their food. They noticed who walked behind them, who lingered too close, who smiled too little or too much. Kindness became suspicious. Silence became dangerous. And through it all, the sense of something forbidden grew stronger, heavier, more present with every passing night. A feeling that the darkness was no longer just the absence of light, but a place where things were being shaped, prepared, and quietly set into motion, guided by hands that moved with purpose, patience, and knowledge that was never meant to be spoken aloud. The truth was not buried in loud confessions or dramatic discoveries. It lived in paper that smelled of mildew and ink that had faded to the color of old bruises. It hid in forgotten rooms where dust gathered like drifted snow, stacked in wooden cabinets that had not been opened in decades. The kind of truth that was never meant to survive, only to exist long enough to be ignored. There were old court notes that no one studied anymore, packed away when new laws replaced old fears. The writing was cramped, hurried, and uneven, as if the hand that held the pen trembled while trying to keep up with the mind. Names were half-written, dates were crossed out. Margins were filled with uncertain words like missing, strange, and unusual. No one wrote murder. No one wrote ritual. They softened everything, as if gentle words could make brutal silence more respectable. Some records were burned. You could see where corners had once been darker, curled inward, eaten by old flame and old decisions. Someone had chosen what the world was allowed to remember and what must be erased. Whole lines were blacked out. Entire pages were torn away. The gaps spoke louder than the words that remained. There were shipping logs that listed people like cargo, tallies and symbols that marked losses without explanation, a line through a name, a blank space where a number should have been, little notes scrawled at the edges, almost as if someone had wanted to say more but had been stopped by fear or command or shame. Somewhere in those papers there were references to a young female whose name was never written in full. Just a mark, just a letter, a shadow of a person. She was mentioned in a way that suggested concern, but not enough to change anything. Not enough to stop anything, only enough to record that someone at some point had noticed. Decades later, when the plantation had long since lost its wealth and the fields had turned wild, a worker clearing old storage buildings found a damp wooden box. Inside were folded pages, wrapped clumsily in cloth that fell apart at the touch. The ink bled through the paper, blurring the words into ghosts of language. These were not official documents, they were private notes, fragments of memory someone never meant to be shared. One page spoke of 22 absences without explanation. Another spoke of strange powders found near the well. Another simply read, "The girl walks at night," and nothing more. No names, no accusations, only fear pressed onto paper so thin it trembled in weak hands. But those pages did not survive long. Moisture ate through them. Mold crawled across the ink. Time stepped in where fire had not. What remained was only fragments, pieces of a story with no clear ending and no clear beginning. The land kept more memory than the records. Old trees twisted in shapes that felt intentional. Soil near the quarters never felt right, too soft even in dry seasons. The well's stones were darkened inside, stained in a way that didn't look like age. People who walked the land after it had been abandoned said it felt crowded, even when completely empty. There were no trials, no public hangings, no loud justice. That kind of ending was never meant for this story. Instead, the truth slipped sideways out of existence. It hid inside rumors passed through families who lived nearby, in stories told carefully, only at night, only when the air was still. Older people spoke of a girl who was not owned by fear the way the rest were, of a presence that moved through darkness without being stopped by it, of someone who unsettled not through chaos, but through control, and then, one day, simply disappeared herself. No grave, no record of sale, no record of death, no shipment listed. She did not show up in the ledgers, where she had once been vaguely marked. She vanished from the written world as thoroughly as the women she was linked to. Some believed she fled, stepping into the deep green walls of the swamp where no chains could follow. Some believed she became something else entirely, something less human and more enduring. Others believed she never left at all, that she simply learned how to move so quietly through the world that history could no longer hold her. There are still places in Louisiana where the ground feels different, heavier, as though something important was buried there without ceremony or stone. Places where the air settles awkwardly and the trees seem too close together. And if you stand there long enough, in the quiet, you might feel the faint sensation of being watched by something that was never brought to justice, never understood, and never truly gone.